Good afternoon and good morning to our West Coast listeners. My name is Juan Thomas, Chair of the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Section. I'm honored today to have as our special guest, Professor Sarah Adams-Schoen, who's a professor of law at the University of Oregon. And we're so happy to have you, Professor Adams-Schoen. Welcome. Can I call you Sarah during our conversation?
You absolutely may, Juan.
All right. So glad to have you. You and I met during our fall conference in Portland, Oregon. You were a panelist during one of our sessions and provided great insight and conversation for our young lawyers in particular, but for all of us. So I want to thank you for doing that. And I kind of wanted to kick off by asking you about what you teach, and specifically, what is your definition of environmental justice?
Yes. Well, so I teach land use law, and I have for quite some time now, and state and local government law, and ocean and coastal law, which all might sound a little disparate, but I think that they're not, because a thread runs through them in my teaching. I teach about planning and kind of the organization of human settlement, environmental, climate impacts related to that, and all of it is grounded in my work for justice, and really recently focused so much on environmental racism, climate racism, and so when I'm talking about environmental justice or climate justice, relatedly, I'm talking about a recognition of massive, disparate toxins and burdens that have been placed on the Black community in particular, and Black people in the United States, as well as other people of color, of course, Native Americans, religious minorities and others. But, I think the research is really there to show that the impact has been greatest over time and presently with respect to Black people and Native Americans, and not to the impact on others. So when I'm talking about environmental justice, I'm talking about that knowledge of that ongoing harm, and the justice is this bold question, like, can we really remediate that? Can we turn it around?
Right. How would you define climate change? It's a term that we hear in media all the time. There's been a debate whether or not there's actually, the climate, is it changing? I think that's kind of been settled, but even in some corners, maybe not. But most of us understand the concept. But how do you define the term?
Climate change. Yeah, and I think as a political matter, it's pretty settled. And now the new kind of denialism is to say, well, it's too late to do anything.
Right.
So climate change, is when I'm talking about it, I think when we're talking about it as an issue, is human induced, human caused, disruption to the climate system, primarily from the destruction of carbon sequestering material like trees and healthy soils, and the burning of fossil fuels. And the change is this massive disruption that we are witnessing all the time now, and even more so if you're in the global south, more tropical zone. But we're witnessing it everywhere. We've already got wildfires within 20 miles of Eugene. I'm already smelling it in the air.
Right. Right. You recently wrote an article that is published by the Brooklyn Law Review, titled "The White Supremacy in Zoning Laws." I think I'm getting that. Yeah, the white supremacist structure of American zoning law. Could you talk a bit about the structural racism in zoning laws, and why I asked that in the context of the economic justice work our section's been doing this year? That's been our theme this year as a section. And so much of what we have discovered and talked about during the year has been the structural forces that create economic injustice, poverty. Could you kind of speak to your article and connect that to economic justice?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. and it is just so. At first I had titled this article American zoning law and the persistent, this persistent legacy of Jim Crow. But I didn't want to, in the end, that was too narrow of a topic. But Jim Crow and the racial zoning that preceded it too on the West Coast that was targeting people, primarily of Chinese descent, there was a recognition at that time that to maintain racial caste, really, and to maintain, coming back to Jim Crow, the badge of slavery, right?
Right.
And that fiction of race and then race-based inferiority and superiority, where people live and what property they can acquire is essential, right? To maintain that fiction and to stoke it. And, so much of the race-based violence is, there, I think, has been a lot of, this perpetuation of this myth that it's around sexuality and, Black men or other men of color, talking to or looking at a white woman or whatnot. But so much of it really is about property, right? So much of that violence has actually been focused on property and the acquisition by Black people of farms and farmlands and of houses, so what this baked in with respect to American zoning law, the law formed in the United States at a period of time when it was accepted at local, state, and federal level, and also really being pursued and promoted, this white supremacism and this desire by people in power to really formalize segregation, to promote those, that fiction of race and race superiority and inferiority, and getting to the economics, to hoard wealth, right, to white people. And that necessarily means taking from others. But what I discovered in my research is it goes beyond just hoarding wealth to white people by propping up the economic status of white-owned property, which is what happened in zoning laws that I can get into more details in a moment. But the law itself was structured to preserve and enhance the value of white property, and not even neutral with respect to property that was owned by people of color, but actually to drive it down. As part of an effort to subjugate and in some places to purge jurisdictions of people of color. And that, that particular structure of American zoning law is still there. Right. So I can go into more detail. I could talk at length. My article's like so long. I asked my spouse to read it for typos, and like 3 hours in, they were like, I can't keep going today.
So I want to just underscore what you are writing about and what you're talking about, what you've researched. You didn't just research this. As you mentioned in your article, you grew up in a Black community. You lived this. So you can speak to this from a personal experience. You have a personal narrative to this context. Could you speak to your own personal story?
Yeah. And, I was just chatting with you right before we started recording too about this. What I learned in doing this research and writing this article that's just about to find its way out into public hands is I had a lot of unresolved, and still do, trauma around that. And then I also had to look at the privilege that I had too, right? That led me to where I am today, which is alive, for one, and sitting in this office as a law professor. But yeah, I grew up in a neighborhood. My family was in deep poverty, and that's been the case for my family for multiple generations. And everyone around me was in deep poverty, and I was in the minority as a white person. And what I learned when I started researching my article was that the census tract where my block is located, where I grew up, was the least white census tract in all of Oregon. And this is that can really, it was if I remember right, I think it was 33% white, which, in some cities that's like, whatever. But we're talking Oregon, which has a history that goes all the way expressly into the 1950s and beyond, 60s, and then beyond, not so, covertly, I should say, maybe,
Right.
of race exclusion. So,
Right.
just the raw numbers of people of color and Black people in particular, especially in Oregon, are low. So to be in a neighborhood that's majority Black, it speaks something. And I, of course, when I was growing up, I didn't realize that our neighborhood, that we had this giant industrial landfill in our neighborhood, and these massive emitters of pollution, and our school had to be torn down because it was toxic to be inside it. And I didn't connect the dots because I was just a kid. But coming back now and looking at it, and then looking still at the status of the neighborhood even today, like there's so many great things that have happened there as a result of community-led action and public interest work.
Right.
But it's still, one of the most toxic places to live.
Wow. Wow. Is it still predominantly African American?
I think that it is not predominantly, but it is still very much a neighborhood that has proportionally has a very large population of people of color.
I wish we had more time to kind of dig into that, but I wanted to shift briefly. As a scholar, professor, we want to encourage people to read your article, but one of the popular books that are out this day that people are reading and keep talking about is The Color of Law. And a lot of that book talks about how law has been used to segregate, intentionally keep people in certain communities and neighborhoods. But you have an interesting critique about the analysis of The Color of Law. Could you kind of share your perspective and your critique and what you want readers of that book to know and understand about that book?
Yeah, and I would say, I recommend that book highly. And I relied on some of Richard Rothstein's research from that book and from other research that he's done. I think he's just advanced understanding a lot with that work. And I'm going to plug someone else's book too, though, right now, as I give this critique, because I also want to plug this book. I have it sitting right on my desk. So this is Cheryl Cashman's book.
Oh,
and,
yes.
White Space, Black Hood. And this is also a phenomenal book, and it's readable. You don't have to have a law degree to wade through it. So I recommend this as well. It's White Space, Black Hood, Opportunity, Hoarding, and Segregation in the Age of Inequality by Cheryl Cashin. And this, I think, for anyone who is getting a lot out of or got a lot out of The Color of Law this is a great book to read. But my critique, and like I hesitate to even quite call it a critique, but my caution to the
That was my word. So.
Yeah. My caution is
Yours, right. Don't
make the mistake of thinking it ends, with what you're reading in this book, right? And in particular, my conclusion from my analysis and my research is that the most powerful mechanism that segregates communities by racial segregation, is zoning law. And Richard Rothstein writes about expressly racial zoning of the Jim Crow era, and he also does write. There are some pages in the book that are devoted to talking about what we kind of think about as zoning now. That doesn't have it doesn't have like a Black neighborhood and a white neighborhood expressly spelled out anymore, of course. Although sometimes, if it did, at least we would have a remedy. But not that I wish it did, I don't. But, the fact that it's not expressly race-based doesn't mean that it wasn't intentionally created to segregate by race. And, it was. And then on top of that, it did it effectively, and it still does, right? And so I don't think, I think that Rich Rothstein's book just really advanced knowledge and understanding, and a lot of people I know who read that book are much more eager to learn now and to
Yeah.
work for justice. But I would just add to it that there is this segregatory mechanism out there, and lots of people know that land use laws have disparate impact. But what I want to add to that is that's no accident, and it's not just a handful, a bad actor here or there, that so some city or some code in one place or another has this, had this racialized, racist intent in the code development. The codes everywhere, whether or not they were adopted by people who consciously knew they were adopting race-based zoning, but I think a lot of them certainly did. They all have this. And so that's something I just want to add, because if we recognize that, then we know we have to act.
I was in a discussion recently with a colleague, and that discussion reminds me of what you're sharing. The conversation centered around the idea that built into our algorithms of how we evaluate land and property, that the premise of those assumptions rather allow for land owned by people of color to be less valuable than land owned by whites, whether it be a house, just property. And it's built into the system, it's embedded.
And that's separate and aside from personal racial animosity, right? That's structural.
Structural, right. Because oftentimes the race question is never even asked. They ask questions around education, income, family size, and though there's assumptions made based upon those answers that's built into that. Would you agree with that analysis?
Yes. And I would say, so I said earlier, I would talk a little bit about the detail, and I think sometimes the detail helps too, right? So, in the United States, we have in our zoning law, we separate and have separate categories for different kinds of housing. And that is unique, or at least when it was developed in the United States originally in, around 1916. I say first adopted by Berkeley, although I think there were a couple really small areas that had also tinkered with it before that, but Berkeley really adopted it widespread.
Right.
The creation of these different zones, basically saying that they're not the same kind of residential areas, right? The single family home, the multifamily home, whatnot. Right. And that was done on purpose. The historical record shows this, because there was concern that express race-based zoning was going to be struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. And in fact, it was in 1917. So the concern was, well, that's going to be struck down. We can't get away with that. And two, racially restrictive covenants, they're not strong enough. There's different ways in which they get invalidated, right? Or stop having force. That maybe they don't get enforced by the benefit holder. Maybe they lapse in time. Maybe you put your subdivision up next to some area that didn't have them, whatever. So there was this concern circulating that they weren't good enough to keep white neighborhoods white. And the planners and the real estate people and the politicians in California and in Berkeley said, we can use economics to achieve the same result. And what we can do is create different zones for different types of housing, right? That's one way we're going to do it. We're going to have these regulatory restrictions that drive up the cost, right? So you have to have a large lot. You have to have a large house on that lot. You have to have a large yard, right? So now, right, you can't, all of that's driving up the cost. You have to have landscaping. You have to have this, and that. Right. We'll put all these on there, hopefully also with our restrictive covenants, right? That was their thinking at the time. Right. And they're crystal clear in the record about why they want to do this. And in California at the time, it was animus against Black people and Asian people, or people of Asian descent. Right. They do that, but these guys are talking nationally. They're at the national planning conferences, And there's some people in the Northeast who are also promoting land use law. And I, just as a little aside too, sometimes people have read through my drafts and said, Sarah, you're acting like they all were just, you're casting them now as it's just good versus evil. And I'm like, no, I'm not. There's plenty that's been written about the good deeds these guys did. I am shedding light on something else. So I don't mean to say that they're just a cardboard, right, one-sided, but there was this national conversation that was going on, and there was this desire to segregate everywhere. And the federal government in particular was working hard to promote segregation. Herbert Hoover was working first as the Secretary of Commerce and then later as president to promote segregation throughout the country. And we know about some of the ways that he and his institution, his administration and the later ones did it, like through Rothstein's book.
Right.
We know about redlining. We know about loans based on the whiteness of a neighborhood, basically,
Right.
and whites only public housing. But what hasn't got enough attention is that they thought that zoning, and not the zoning from Louisville that got overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in Buchanan versus Worley, but the zoning we have today that divided up these neighborhoods and made restrictive single-family neighborhoods, they thought that was essential to their program of segregation. And they came, the Hoover administration and Federal Housing Administration at the time went out and did thousands of presentations to local governments saying, adopt this zoning, or you're not going to be able to get loans, good loans for your people for housing. And they were coercive, they were propagandistic, and they were pervasive. And
Right.
so zoning is really neglected as one of the major tools in that campaign to segregate. And so what's so unfortunate, but also not surprising, right, that this has been like kind of so carefully ignored or
Right.
taken out of, like this mythology around race neutral zoning, is that it persists unquestioned.
So after we read your article and we read The Color of Law and the other books that we've referenced here this afternoon, what should lawyers do? What are some ways we can be engaged strategically in changing some of these structures? What would you recommend?
Yeah, so one, I recommend a caution here, and that is that really kind of white dominated planning and land use experts have pursued well-intentioned reform many times, and sometimes to pretty disastrous effect in terms of equity. And so, what I think, I'm not even close to the only one saying this is, but the conversations have to be listening to the people who are most impacted by the law itself, right? And just really diversifying the profession, who's in leadership. And that's not easy, because that can result in harm if it's done poorly. So there's a lot there to consider. And then I have it in my article, and I didn't devote my article to reform. I really devoted my article to revealing this history and this structure. But I do end with some principles for equitable reform. And so one of them is eliminating single-family zoning. I do believe it's essential, but it is not by any means a panacea. And doing that only has even the potential to cause harm, equity harm. So it has to be done in conjunction with some other things. And because the exclusive single family zoning, that hoarding to those neighborhoods of privilege, is only part of the story. The other part of the story is the putting together the putting together of the places where people of color live, and really destructive land uses, right? And that was part of it too. That emerged out of that 1916 Berkeley Code that got copied and proliferated throughout the country also, right? The placing of, well, I mean, it was so driven and born of white supremacism that the cities were studied and identified, this is where people of color live, and then those areas would be either zoned industrial or zoned right next to industrial. And there's even talk in the record of the zoning of Berkeley that the industrial zone, an area where there was a mix of manufacturing and housing, was zoned industrial so that the people who lived in that housing, who were predominantly people of color, wouldn't be able to bring nuisance claims against the industry. So it is to protect the industry against their neighbors. So that's the other side of it. And so if we're only addressing dismantling the single family exclusivity side, but we're not addressing the fact that we still have neighborhoods where this is permitted.
Right.
In every city, same for the Coley neighborhood where I grew up, same for the Bethel, this West Eugene Bethel neighborhood, but all over the place, people still breathe air that is, the asthma rates and the absenteeism and even cancer rates. So yeah, you asked what we can do. I think doing kind of the anti-racist work, that equity-based work, it requires a lot of self-education, especially, for everyone, but also if you're white, like just barging in and trying to do that work. And I don't speak as someone who's perfect. I speak as someone who's made the mistakes, and I will make more. But it requires a thick skin, because you're going to make mistakes, and just a lot of listening, but also dedication. Like, we cannot continue to plow forward as if we have a race neutral system when we don't.
Right. Well, in spite of your mistakes, your work has offered enlightenment and educational resources for us. So we're going to share your article, the links to your article. And how can people find you and follow your work?
Well, if they're on the SSRN, the Social Science Research Network, but I do believe that might have a paywall, but I can be followed there. I was tweeting, but Twitter is, I'm just not a big Twitter promoter anymore.
No,
so
you don't care for the
hard
honor?
to follow. But I'm instead of saying how I can be followed, because right now I do have a Twitter handle, but I can't even think of what it is off the top of my head. Maybe you can link to it. But I'm just going to make one more plug, and that is for education. And right now there's this backlash against accurate education in this country. And one of the things that Rothstein does really well towards the very end of his book is point out how we already didn't teach race history correctly before this backlash, right? That all these major history books, we have major history books that, would mention Rosa Parks and not that she was a Black woman. How do you even do that? Like, what, right? And things like this. So, and my focus is on law schools, and others have told me, no, don't let planning off the hook. Well, I'm a law professor, so planning, but law schools, right? Like, I am just, I'm impassioned by wanting to transform the way we teach property and land use law, coming back to economics, right? We can't teach it as if it's race neutral. We can't teach it as if these kind of founding fathers, as they used to be called, weren't also promoting, racial subjugation, or that like major U.S. Supreme Court cases that were really kind of wink, wink, this is race neutral, when everyone in the room knew it wasn't, or that land use meetings where right now today, things are being passed and discussions are happening that we have to do X, Y, and Z to promote the character of this neighborhood as a family neighborhood. Well, that phrasing has roots in oppression, right? And people who sit in those rooms, who are living in, I'll just harken to mine, right? The Coley neighborhood or the Bethel neighborhood, they know that has not meant them. And people who sit in the law school classroom, I really want us to live up to our commitment to diversify our profession. I don't think we're going to have this kind of reform without that.
Right.
And to diversify our profession, we have to have the classroom be a place where you feel included, where your history growing up in a neighborhood like that, or having your mom grow up like that, or whatnot, and to me, I think we have to be so much more honest about the racial structure of law and the racial harm that's continuing, so that people can be in that law school classroom and feel seen and heard.
Well, Sarah, we could talk for another hour about these issues. You have a passion and a commitment to social justice, to environmental, economic justice that I sincerely appreciate. And I was so glad that we met last year and wanted to have you on as one of our guests. So Sarah Adams-Schoen, thank you for your contribution. You are truly a social justice advocate and a pioneer. So we appreciate your contribution and encourage everyone to read your work and follow you. And hopefully we can talk again in the near future.
I hope so too. And thank you so much for what you're doing for justice as well.
Thank you. Thank you all for listening. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you next week.